More on the deteriorating conditions in Yemen. We're joined now by Sunjeev Bery of Amnesty International USA. He's Advocacy Director for Middle East and North Africa. Welcome back to the broadcast. So tell us, how dire is the situation from what you're hearing? I mean, we're hearing reports of 100,000 people homeless, dozens and dozens killed, as many as 75 children killed.
Right. I mean, this is a looming crisis, and it's gone from bad to worse, in part because the Saudi Arabia-led coalition conducting the airstrikes has been reckless and appears to not be careful enough in differentiating between civilians and combatants, and as a result, many civilians have died.
But we see this in many war-type situations. We saw it in Gaza, where they accidentally hit a school. What generally unfolds from this point forward? Does it take a horrific act like this to get the two sides to come together?
Well, it's difficult to say. What's clear is that all of the combatants need to follow the rules of international human rights law and humanitarian law. They need to make a clear distinction between civilians and combatants and not do some of the reckless attacks that have led to residents being burned alive. You know, the worst case scenario is Syria, for example, where for years now, hundreds of thousands have died. And in that particular case, while in Yemen, the Russian and Chinese governments have articulated humanitarian concerns, in Syria, the Russian and Chinese governments have stood in the way and blocked UN action.
What generally happens, Mr. Bery, in a situation like this when the International Red Cross can't even get in? They can't even send a cargo plane in to drop supplies.
Well, it's a pretty tragic situation, and it gets even worse than that, because in some cases, internally displaced Yemenis have come to camps where they're staying, only to be struck in at least one case by airstrikes from the Saudi Arabian-led coalition. There was a case of a bridge in a camp where internally displaced Yemenis are, where a number of civilians were killed just for being in the camp.
You've got as many as 100,000 people out of their homes. Where do they go in a situation like this? How long before we see some sort of refugee camp?
Well, the refugees, if they leave the border and move into Saudi Arabia, for example, then they'd become refugees. We're already seeing the IDP, the internally displaced people's camps. And on top of that, you know, Yemen has long dealt with some serious issues: a water crisis, access to food, poverty. All of these problems go from bad to worse in an environment where the military coalition, which involves intelligence from the United States, is dropping bombs engaging in airstrikes in a very reckless way.
There is no water, we understand.
Severe water shortages. We've seen reports of people lining up, carrying those ubiquitous yellow buckets and containers, struggling to basically meet their basic water needs, their basic food needs. And if this bombardment campaign continues in the reckless manner that it has, one only knows what's next in terms of the crisis.
So a diplomatic truce is needed within the next 24 to 48 hours, or what kind of repercussions could we see in terms of the humanitarian crisis? Well,
we've seen the most extreme cases in Syria, of course, where you have a much larger country, of course. Well, actually, populations are roughly the same. We've had about 200,000 people be killed, 200,000 people killed, and then some 11 million people flee their homes. So the problem can always get worse unless the international community stands up for humanitarian law, basic human rights, and makes sure that civilians are not caught in the crossfire.
What kind of pressure can organizations like yourself put on the UN and other diplomatic bodies?
Well, Amnesty International is calling on the participants in the conflict to respect civilians. That means that the Saudi Arabian-led military coalition should do a much better job of avoiding targeting civilian areas, or areas where, for example, residences are right next to an oil depot or a fuel area. At the same time, it's also important for the Houthi armed militias and other armed groups to avoid situating themselves in civilian areas, though that's not an excuse for bombing a neighborhood or bombing a school or any of those sorts of actions.
All righty, Sunjeev Bery with Amnesty International, we appreciate your time and shedding some light on this deteriorating situation.